So here we are again, continuing on with the Apostles' Creed. Now we move on to the beginning, really, of the second section of the Creed. The first one's pretty short. We believe in God the Father Almighty, Maker of heaven and earth. This section's a little longer. It's about Jesus Christ, and the first line of it is Jesus Christ, His only Son, our Lord. Or I guess really the way you say it is, we believe in Jesus Christ, His only Son, our Lord. So we'll just start breaking this down. I think it's fine to almost kind of go word by word a little bit because each one has a lot baked into it. I guess it's fine if we say it that way. Is that a weird way to put it?
There's a lot
Um,
baked into it. No, I don't think
yeah.
so.
Okay.
This one's good, I think, and I like this line a lot. When we were going through the creeds and prepping, this is one of the easier ones. It's going to touch on a lot of things. You'll find, I think, as we go through the podcast, and Ben, you can tell me if you think I'm right here, that the section on Jesus Christ, even though the section on God we did was really important and really valid, this one's going to stand out as really important because this is the crux of the Christian faith at the time they're creating the creeds, right? Like this is who they're trying to express. Like Romans have conceptions of God. The Hebrews have a really strong conception of a monotheistic God. But Jesus is a unique figure that stands out among the rest, like among the fray. There's not really a religious figure like him at that point, or really kind of ever. And I mean that like just thinking about comparative religion today. So I like the Jesus section. I think it's gonna be good, and I like this part because it's a great jumping off point to understand like Jesus at his core, like who he is, and then we'll start talking about the narrative of Jesus. And I think it's really cool.
Yeah. So we'll just jump in. First one, Jesus Christ, which I think that's something in Christianity that we tend to take a lot for. Well, we take a lot of things for granted, but this one in particular, I think we just assume a lot. We really don't dive into exploring, well, what do we actually believe about who Jesus is, as a person, as a being. First, the first part of that, Jesus, right? Jesus, he was a man. I'm not, obviously we believe God, or Jesus was fully God and fully man. But he did actually live in a place and a time, first century Palestine. Like he lived in that culture. That's where uh, the incarnation happened. So he was born and raised in that. Like he was a part of a respected Jewish family. Like he was a relative of a priest, because we know that from Mary and Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's husband was, he's one of the priests. He was the adopted son of a carpenter or stoneworker, depending on which historian you look at. It could be either one, which is interesting. I don't know if you've heard that. I read some a few years ago that Joseph could have been a stoneworker just because of the word that's used, and I don't know. Make of it what you will. Regardless, um, which I think that one we could spend time on that. I don't know if I will. Maybe it's something we'll come back to in the future. But just the fact that Jesus was adopted essentially by Joseph.
There's a lot to say about the adoption and the metaphor that Paul uses later for our adoption. Now, I don't know if necessarily it's that closely tied, but
Right.
you know, I think it's good. Um, Adoption's important though because it implies birth,
Hmm.
right, by Mary, um,
Yeah.
and that God is the Father. So, like, if you want to jump back in, I don't know if you're going to cut that, but like, if you want to jump back in, we could talk about that real quick.
Um,
'Cause that's a big deal, the virgin
yeah.
birth.
Yeah. It is. I do think there's a lot of value to sort of the story behind the story, where, um, like, how much of an impact the incarnation actually had on the people that were like directly impacted by it. Which I know sounds redundant, but it's like it reminds me of Christopher Hitchens, who he's passed away now, which I actually find unfortunate. I really enjoyed listening to him. I felt like he articulated his ideas really well. I thought he had uh, some very good um, questions, very good challenges to the Christian faith. He was not a theist by any stretch of the imagination. He actually called himself an anti-theist, I think. He was
Yeah.
like, no, I'm not an atheist. I'm an anti-theist. I hate religion. But one of the things he said, and you might have heard this, I don't know how well you followed Hitchens at all, but one of the arguments he would make was, what seems more likely, that God actually became man, or that a Jewish girl would tell a fib, um, which always struck me as a strange argument because it sort of implies that Mary and Joseph were not really affected at all by this. But if you follow the narrative, you actually find out that, in the beginning of the gospel narratives that tell this story, Luke in particular, Mary and Joseph are both well respected people. Like that's how they're introduced.
Mhm.
You can tell from their some of their family members that they're well respected, some of which I already mentioned. But as the story goes on, and then we obviously have the story where they go to Bethlehem, where Mary's about to give birth, uh, and like there's no room for them anywhere, which is strange for a couple reasons. I mean, for one, the phrase that's used is "there's no room in the inn," but Bethlehem was not a major stopping place, so our concept of an inn, like a hotel, like they didn't really have those. The word that's used is more like a guest room because that's what people did. They would travel and they would stay in people's houses in a separate room. But the fact that there's no one there to accept this pregnant woman who's about to go into labor, I think says a lot about the trials that her and Joseph faced, like socially. Like, because Joseph is respected. They're going to Joseph's and Mary's like ancestral town. Surely they would have some sort of relatives there, someone that they would know. I mean, just culturally, that doesn't seem like that much of a stretch. But the fact that there's no one there to help them out, like even just to try and make room for them, I think says a lot about how people perceived them. Like a lot of people did not actually believe in what Mary was saying, and it seems like Joseph certainly took a brunt too to his reputation by the fact that they go to Bethlehem and people are just like, yeah, we can't help you, like sorry, and they just have to, you know, Mary has to give birth in a manger. Um, it's just a interesting part of the story. So like these people were heavily impacted by what happened. It was not an easy thing, but I think that also makes it more real. Like you're talking about a young Jewish girl who's essentially a single teenage mother, and Joseph is like he hasn't done anything to cause this. He's just sort of inheriting the effects of this sudden teenage pregnancy. This person he's engaged to, he doesn't really know what to do with it. Like an angel has to intervene to tell him, like, no, like what she's saying is actually legit. Like it's okay. I mean, it's a really weird and uncomfortable story when you really start like thinking about it. Which I remember I told that once to a group at a church on like a for Wednesday night study during Advent, and there was a woman in there who she was raising twins. She was a single mom because her husband had divorced her. It was a whole mess. But I remember her coming up to me afterwards and saying like, I never thought about that before. That Mary was kind of like a single mom. Like she didn't have a husband who was always there to like take care of her. She was staying with her family. Like this woman was in the same situation, obviously a little different in several ways. But it's one of those things where like when you actually tell the story and really think about it like in real terms, it's uh, I think it resonates a lot more than sort of the way in which we talk about it that we tend to take a lot for granted.
No, it's good. And I was thinking about that too as you're kind of chatting, like with Mary specifically, and we're talking about like the skepticism and really responding to Hitchens directly saying what's more likely, that she fibbed. I, I think the irony of all this is that like the fact that Christian faith in a really reasonable time in history, right, when like philosophy, thought, and like intellectualism was really in and really in vogue in first century Rome, that
Yeah,
they're like, yeah, no, we're gonna do like this like really really bold, really really powerful, like really really claim, and we're gonna do it on the witness of a woman who isn't exactly like, especially within first century Judaism, the most like influential or trustworthy source, and
yeah,
you know I think sometimes you have to think about the circumstance. Like, what's the point? If you're trying to make something up, you want to make it believable. So when you lie or when you create a lie, you put in fragments of truth,
hmm
right? Because you want it to
yeah,
be palatable, like you want it to be convincing.
hmm
So when you're outright saying like, no, this like you just say off. Honestly, it's a little off the wall. Like, is really what you're describing. When you say some off the wall things, like yeah, that's a big deal. I mean, and even if you think about Joseph, right, himself, like he was really skeptical of what Mary said. he had to have his own revelation to be like, hey,
Mhm.
no, she's not lying. She's not crazy. This is the thing. He's like, okay, I'm about to be
Yeah.
stepdad to God, which, which like, when you say it that way is insane. But
Right.
it's I think it's really bold and it's really powerful. So like, when we talk about Jesus, as a person, as a man, like that's pretty unique circumstances to grow up in. And
Mhm.
this is a pretty tight knit community, the Jewish community,
Yeah.
um, especially under the persecution they're under. So word gets around pretty quickly, I would assume. I can't say I know that for certain.
Hmm.
Um, but no, when we were talking about adopted, I was just thinking of the challenge of that. And I was just thinking about the leap of faith and kind of the symbolism of like, really like a child that he's not illegitimate, but kind of illegitimate in some ways, right? He's not
Yeah, like
Joseph's child.
he'd certainly be seen that way. I mean, like his brothers, depending on which tradition you follow, even if you believe that Mary gave birth to, all of Jesus's brothers, because he did have, sort of weird to say, biological brothers.
Yeah,
Maybe, I mean, at best, like half brothers or something, or like it was a blended family. It was so like there's a lot of dynamics there that Jesus, just as a person, had to experience.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, wow.
Yeah. I know that was not in the notes, but I just thought and maybe explain that better. But also to go along with it, something else that is interesting is the idea that Jesus learned of the Jewish traditions, like he was taught the Jewish traditions, like he became a rabbi, which you can get into all sorts of discussion on. Like, was Jesus born with all this inherent knowledge? Did it just come onto him suddenly? Did he have to gradually learn things? Like, was there a limit on his intellectual awareness um, as part of the incarnation? Which I feel like that could be a whole discussion on its own. So I don't know if I want to jump into that really, because really I'm just describing. I'm trying to just describe that Jesus was a person who existed in history, and that's something that historians, by and large, actually accept. The idea of Jesus as God is a whole nother idea, but I mean, even secular scholars, like atheistic scholars, like they accept, like, yeah, like there is certainly evidence that there was a man in first century Palestine named Jesus who led a movement, who had followers, and that movement became Christianity. Um, so it is fascinating though that the idea that Jesus never existed is considered preposterous, even among like uh, respected um, non-Christian scholars. So Jesus was a person who who existed, not just as an idea. But yeah, the second part is also important too. That we call him Christ, which is really just the sort of the Greek way of saying the Messiah, right? The recognized person who would restore Israel, who would enact God's plan of redemption, the one that was declared in the prophecies of the Old Testament. Um, so I don't know if you want to add anything to that part. I know I have some notes here, but if you wanted to jump in on that one.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I was reading a little bit about the Jewish history, what was going on, and why they came with the word Christ and some of the Septuagint. That's not really relevant here, but I think it's important because with the Gnostics specifically, right, and that's the context that they're responding and creating the creed for. And then we'll talk about some modern day parallels real quick. you know, a lot of people, or at least what the Gnostics are doing, is they're saying, yeah, Jesus is like a good teacher, or they're redefining his role, and they're shifting the understanding of the Messiah. So when you title him Jesus Christ, that's a title that has a meaning to it and a context behind it, right? Christ is the Greek word for Messiah. We've been mentioned that, and so if you got to remember that this is all in a Jewish context, like you can't remove the biblical text from its Jewish context. I had a temptation to do that when I was a lot younger, and it was a huge mistake because you'll miss a lot. But my point is this: that what the Gnostics were doing was trying to remove him from that context and put him into this framework and this wording of Greek Platonism. And we've talked ad nauseum about Platonism, so I'm going to stop. But I'm going to say this is that their idea of a Messiah was a physical person, not some kind of ethereal like lifeboat, not some kind of thing to pull them away that was going to free them and is going to change them. See, they were oppressed people. They're historically an oppressed people. They've been exiled from their own homeland that God has given Abraham multiple times by these really large armies, and the most recent one was Rome. So it was the expectation of the Jewish peoples that the Messiah would free them from that. That's the whole thing with Maccabee, right? The Judas Maccabeus, right?
Hmm.
So when Jesus comes and he flips their ideas on its head, excuse me, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm going to free you, and I'm going to free a lot more." They don't really grasp that. But the title is really important because it's the signifier for both Jew and for the Greek and for the Gentile, that this person is the Holy One. This is the person that actually is going to liberate us and pull us out. So the liberation it's talking about is contra, and the name is contra, like contradictory. That is
Hmm.
to the idea of the Neoplatonist Jesus that is a messenger and harbinger for the ultimate lifeboat evacuation. He's a liberator. He's active and breathing, and he did it now. That's really what that word means. That's the significance of Messiah. And so I really wanted to make sure we had a chance to touch on that because I think it's really important. Um, when the Romans took over really the known world at that point, um, and the known world of history, I suppose. Uh, and they started to really like enforce their laws. They made everybody speak Greek. So this word was a Jewish word that is really kind of unique because they had to find a Greek word for it, and that's what this is. So this isn't some like Greek word thrown around. Like you don't see, Aristotle, Plato. You don't see like Caesar and those guys saying Christ. Like it doesn't happen. So it's a significant word. And it has like a real powerful background to it. It's got a context to it, a narrative to it that a lot of our language doesn't have. Does that make sense what I'm saying, Ben? Did that come out clear?
Yeah, yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying. Yeah, definitely. And just to give a little bit of context, I know you mentioned Judas Maccabeus. So just for background, if anyone's curious, Judas Maccabeus lived in the intertestamental period between Old Testament and New Testament. I forget the exact year or years he lived, but it was during a time when Rome had taken over Jerusalem, and I believe they also set up a statue to Zeus in the temple. And Judas was the son of a priest, um, and he sort of led a rebellion, started this mass movement to try and kick the Romans out, and he actually succeeded in getting the Romans kind of out of Jerusalem. They cleansed the temple, they destroyed the statue to Zeus, and a lot of people really thought that Judas was this Messiah. They were like, yeah, like this is, what the prophets are talking about. We're finally going to experience the independence again. We're finally going to be our own nation. We're going to have, just freedom from all these foreign powers. And this is the guy who's going to do it. And I think that moment certainly cemented in the minds of a lot of people that this is what a Messiah looks like, which I wonder. Certainly, they had that idea before. Otherwise, Judas Maccabeus probably wouldn't have been seen as a Messiah figure. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it does make you wonder if that's a reason why the people in Jesus' time didn't recognize him as Messiah, because he didn't really fit that image the way that had been cast for them. So that's just
Yeah.
a little bit of context to Judas Maccabeus. But
I got one more thing I want to tack on here, Ben. That's why when you read in the Gospels, when the Pharisees, I believe it's the Pharisees, not the Sadducees, but it's the Pharisees that come up to Jesus and they're like, what do we do about taxes? What do we do with this coin?
mm,
And he says, give to Caesar's what is Caesar's and give to God's what is God's. The
yeah,
reason that it's such a mic drop moment is not because of its implications, but because what he's saying is like, yeah, we don't need to tell Caesar to kick rocks, like, which is the opposite of what you're saying, that they didn't need, like, that's not the idea of Messiah. Messiah was liberator. Now
mhm.
we have done a bad job in the American church. This is a side tangent. I just want to go on this rant real quick. Like
Go for
we've
it.
done a bad job in the American church of keeping that as a core central theme and identity of Jesus Christ as a liberator. Now we talk about it in a broad sense as a liberator of sin, a freer of sin. But when you think of liberator, this is like a war battle thing. This is like the imagery in Revelation in the early part of the book, right? When Jesus has like feet of bronze and like his tongue is a sword, uh, like that idea that like he's ready made for this kind of like battle here. And more to that, like think about our ideas of social justice in the early church. Now, this is not beginning on a political tangent, so everybody who's listening to this podcast, take a deep breath. Um, all it is the idea that like we're going to liberate people from the things that prevent them from being able to follow God to the fullest. So, housing the orphans, showing them what a good father figure looks like, right? Feeding the widows who couldn't provide for themselves, so they were just there to starve and or find an alternative way to make funds, which is never really a good way,
Right.
right? And so it's the idea of liberating people from a circumstance that they have been. The word oppression comes to mind, but it's got political connotations I don't want to use. But circumstances, liberating them from circumstances that don't allow them to participate in the kingdom life or to fully actively move into the kingdom and be part of that church and that movement, right? It becomes a place of refuge. So the second part of this of the creator here on the sentence that we'll be looking at is Jesus Christ, and we're looking at his only son. I think this is a really important place for us to start. For one, right, the Son of God was a title for a king, right? It's a big deal. Royalty in many cultures are seen as divine beings. So, example, Rome, right? Caesar was considered a god. You can worship any other god, but you also have to recognize Caesar as a god as well, right? So, these people, these divine beings, they justify their rule, especially in these more like despot monarchy. I guess their monarchy is a really bad word. More like like
Yeah.
very very despotic societies, right? Like we have a real despot here, almost like a fascist, but not as many. It's a little different, right? A little different than our political context for us to think about. But this guy is the head deal. So what he'll do is he or she, well, mostly he all the time, really. They will say that they have this divine right, like they are divine in some sense, right? They are God or the Son of God. So it's a big royal title. So when we say that to Jesus about Jesus, we're giving him a title of royalty, and it's a big deal, right? On the separate note, I really want to take a smaller point to talk about the specificity of his only son. See, the Gnostics, what they would say is that the one, right, their idea of God, that group was trying to twist the truth here, and they would say like, oh, well, one of the things that the one created split off and created the material world, and it was bad, and they create this what we call dualism, right, like good versus evil, like Lord of the Rings moment
Mhm.
stuff, right? You know, uh, they would create that kind of narrative, and then they would say like Jesus is the one that revealed us and showed us how to get to the one, but then he revealed more to us, and that's how we got here. So when they say his only son, they really want to be specific, like this is a one-time deal. right,
Yeah.
right, like it's not like God's going around like Zeus having babies. This isn't a thing. And that sounds playful, but it's really really powerful and really really important because it's specific for his role and like who Jesus is, right? Like we talked a little bit about Mary and that virgin birth. It's an important thing. He's not, and depending on your tradition, you may or may not agree with this, because I know that some Christian denominations aren't super hard into the virgin birth. I tend to be. I think it's a big deal, right? Like
Do you
this is
mean virgin birth in terms of like the perpetual virginity of Mary, or do you mean virgin birth as in Jesus, or sorry, that Mary was a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus?
I would say the latter rather than the former.
Oh, okay.
I think maybe I'm.
No, that's fine. I'm just I guess I haven't heard much of that conversation of the idea that Mary was a virgin. Like there was challenge against that. I know
So
in non-Christian circles there
yes,
is, but
yeah. There's there as far as I'm aware, there was a small time which, and I think it was the United Methodist Church. I had this conversation with a person who was active in the denomination in
Mhm.
college. That was now 5 years ago, 4 years ago. The point in college I had it, and I'm fairly confident they were United Methodist. And there was like a
Mhm.
small controversy in a group of people that were just saying like it doesn't matter if it's a virgin birth or not. Like, you know, I don't really understand the hoops they have to get through to get there. I'll be honest, I can't articulate
Yeah.
the argument in enough, like well enough to tell you. And if you're United Methodist listening to this, I'm really sorry if I'm butchering it or if I'm accusing you of something not true. I don't remember very well, but I remember this. I remember strictly saying that their denomination came out with like their official statements, and their official
Mhm.
statements just left it open to interpretation. So you could fall on one side of the aisle or the other, and their whole
Really?
thing doesn't matter. And maybe it's because they just didn't want to skewer the church, split the church over it. Maybe it was just lack of oversight. I don't remember, but it was a thing that caused some controversy because people were like, "No, you can't land there." I tend to land pretty hard, like, "Hey, virgin birth is a big deal," and I think the
Yeah.
creed. really what kind of what we're talking about here is the point of that. Like this is his only son. Like God became man, and he was both God and man, right? This person of Jesus, and he came down and lived and walked in our shoes, and this is the only time that that's happened.
Hmm.
Full stop.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what I'm trying to articulate here. So when we talk about his only son, it's really really important.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is. As for the virgin birth, I think that's actually the next line, born of the Virgin Mary. So we will actually come back to that. So
Cool.
that's just a little teaser.
So
There's a very important line. I do find that fascinating, though. I have to look into that with the United Methodist Church. Um, Ironically, they didn't split over that, but they did split over something else involving human sexuality. So we'll
no
leave
comment.
that be. No,
I'm gonna plead the fifth.
it's all good. No, like when that happened, I had a lot of contact with United Methodists in my area, so it's a difficult it is a difficult thing. So I'm not trying to make light of it, but
Yeah. Anytime a church splits,
there it is.
there are no winners.
No, there, yeah, very true. But yeah, as for Jesus as the Son of God, yeah, it's the fact that it's his only son. Also, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but something else that I'm thinking of is, I think it also differentiates between the idea that like Israel's leaders who did carry the title Son of God, like the kings did carry that title, but to claim that Jesus was his only son also kind of strips, I think intentionally and in a good way, strips any notion that anyone who can call themselves a leader under God is in any way divine. That's simply not the case. Only Jesus is, which I think just just sort of adds to what you've already said. Like there is no other representative. It's not like God split off into these different personalities or in lesser forms. It is exclusively Jesus.
And that's a big deal. That's a big reason that the Romans are going to come in, and it's good because it differentiates the Christians from other religions too, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
that hard. I'll use the phrase exclusivist kind of a point here compared to the culture that they're in, right? And it's really really important. Like this man is the Son of God. He is the liberator, the savior, the one that will lead us to promise, not Caesar Augustus of Rome. And so
Mm-hmm.
what you'll find, or what you would find if you looked in a lot of Gnostic texts, is I call it have your cake and eat it too theologies. So for the Gnostics, they wanted to have like a lot of them were words are hard. They were aristocratic in the terms they were aristocrats, right? They were wealthy. That took way too long to say. They were aristocrats who were wealthy.
It's okay.
And so listeners, I'm sorry. So they had this ability, or they had the freedom to like have more resources and do things. And so like they're not into like shaking cages, because shaking cages might expose them to risk that if you're wealthy you don't really want to take. So what you'd see is a lot they have these mild versions of Gnosticism. um, that was some of the text that was, at least I understood as an implication in some of the texts I was reading on Gnosticism.
Hmm.
There's no specific place that I found that they said that they like didn't want to affirm this, but the more you shift and allow for flexibility within the Christian narrative of like Jesus as a person and his life and his role, the more you allow yourself to justify different things that come in, so they could worship Caesar and not be persecuted, right? But also
Mm-hmm.
have like this idea of a Platonic like escape theology. So again, have your cake and eat it too there, right? It would allow them to kind of, I call it, um, I call it intellectual backflips, because you kind of do like intellectual gymnastics to like
Yeah.
to figure out, to like get to what you really want if you're not being consistent, and it allowed them
Yeah.
to do that because they just consistently just skipped over things. Like, oh, that's not
Yeah. Yeah. It also reminds me. So there was a term I learned a while back when I was studying Genesis. I was actually following a course from Yale. Like they have a YouTube channel, and it was a course on Old Testament. And I was introduced to this term called monolatry, which is the idea that you can worship several gods, but there's one God that stands above the rest of them. And it sounds like that's actually throughout a lot of Israel's history, that's a view that they actually had. Like they adopted a lot of other gods and goddesses, but they still held Yahweh as the primary one. It sounds like if you look at history, it's actually similar to what the early Christians practiced, and even sort of how you described it, where they could have this view, or they felt they could have this view of, oh no, we can still acknowledge that Caesar is like a divine being, but really God's number one. Um, which again, this claim, his only son, strikes against that one too. It's like no, 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 like there's nothing else. Like this isn't a monolatrous. That's a weird one. Uh,
Yeah.
monolatrous relationship where as long as I'm first, then you can have as many gods as you want. It's like no, that's not the case. Um, I feel it connects. I don't know. Maybe you feel that doesn't connect with what you were saying. So if it doesn't,
No,
I
it does.
apologize.
No, it's
Okay.
spot on. Yeah, it's a big deal. And there's a reason they had to clarify this, right? This is a conversation that's happening a lot in the culture they're in. So this isn't only directed to the Gnostics. This is the broader culture. This is your identity as a Christian. That when you embrace this and think about the modern implications of this too, maybe not thinking about comparing other people to God, but like the exclusivity of saying that
Mhm.
Jesus is Lord, that He is the Son of God, like what that requires of you if His claims are true. um, but
Yeah.
more to the point, like what they're saying is like this is a zero sum game. Like this is a point where there's no contention. I think only is one of the very unique words in there. It's a very specific word, and they really want to. I think this is a part of the creed that they really want to that should be hammered home, that we
Hmm.
really reflect on and think about. It sounds shallow. His only son. Well, yeah, duh. The Bible doesn't talk about Jesus having or God having, the Zeus babies I was making a joke about earlier. But if this is God's only son and these claims are true, right? You've affirmed that God exists, and now you're affirming who Jesus is.
Hmm.
The implication for you is that this is a big deal. This is your life you're staking on it. In ancient Rome, for us today, think about the truth claims that requires us to do. Maybe we need to rethink the way we go about worshiping different things in everyday life.
Hmm.
We don't have the temptation to worship like other people as gods, but
Hmm.
we elevate other people in different ways, like our celebrities. I have the temptation to do this for like I love entertaining myself with like reading, so I like authors. Like I think authors are
Hmm.
so wise and great. There's one that's coming to mind that I have to like remind myself, like, oh yeah, that's not right. You know what I mean? I was actually about to quote this person in relation to this, but then again, I have to stop myself sometimes and realize like this isn't the savior that I serve. This isn't the only person that has access to. This isn't the person that has the mouthpiece of divine wisdom. This is a person that just has something good to say. If that makes any
Yeah.
sense to you.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of a stretch, I guess, to some extent, but I really want to. I think it's important. It's something that I've been challenging myself with is trying to. And maybe this is something we cut later, but something I've been trying to challenge myself with is that if Jesus is who he says he is, it requires more of me than I'm all like than I think I'm always willing to give.
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
if he is who he says he is, that fundamentally shifts the paradigm of the world I live in. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's true. No, it's fine. We actually touch on that a little later. Just
Sorry.
the sort of the last third. No, 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 you're good. It's fine.
It's so
But I
interconnected.
just, yeah, exactly. Which makes some of these conversations difficult because everything, well, almost everything, it feels like just tends to double back and touch on a lot of other stuff, which is a reason why I find theology so fascinating because it's not just uh, a collection of fragmented discussions and points and doctrinal stances or claims. Like they build off of each other, um, which is why sometimes you have to be really careful whenever you make a theological claim, because you have to recognize that whenever you're making a claim, you're not just affecting the direct aspect you're trying to discuss. You're affecting other things as well. Um, so, like some people might say, well, I guess I'll use the virgin birth as an example, right? If you're talking about the virgin birth and whether or not it's significant, whatever claim you make about that, wherever you're going to land on that particular subject, it's not going to affect just that subject. It's going to ripple out, and it's going to have implications in areas where you might not even immediately consider, but it's going to have a far-reaching effect, um, which is why Christian doctrine took a long time to solidify, because these things had to be discussed, they had to be fleshed out. Um, so that's uh, just throwing that out there again. But it is important, which is why these conversations on theology, I think, are really important, because it helps us, I think, better appreciate the depth of Christian belief, and the interconnectedness of it, which to me is a very beautiful thing. Just how everything relates to everything else.